Well, I know it's Thanksgiving week, and it's obvious to me that half of our congregation is traveling, and I think the half that's traveling are all in Branson, from what I've been hearing. So I'm really glad you're here, and I do hope that you have a very blessed holiday week this week. And don't know what your plans are, but if you're with family or if you're by yourself, I hope it's a blessed day. And I do thank you for being here. I'm grateful for those who are watching us live at a distance. And I know things are a little different this morning. Burke is not here for the reason you heard, and Zonell is filling in. And we don't have slides up there like we normally do. And my coat is unbuttoned. Burke always tells me to button my coat so I can hide these wires. But there's a problem. It won't button very easily. So I think I just got too small a coat. It couldn't be my stomach, okay? But either way, I'm glad you're here. I want to begin our lesson this morning as we inch our way into the book of Romans, the first chapter. I want to begin by having you think about the word excuse. Have you ever made excuses? An excuse is, I think, maybe defines something like this. It is our reasoning or our rationale that we speak to justify why we did not do a certain thing or why we were not where we should be or whatever mistake it is. We use an excuse, and we all have used them. Probably those of you who are teachers, and I know Greg and Terry McKee, who are normally here in Branson, so they're teachers, and Greg Cox has been a teacher, and Vicky's been a teacher. And how often do students come and say, well, I didn't get my homework done because of this or that, or I'm late for class because of this or that, or, yeah, I took a swing at that guy over there because he did this and that. You know, have you ever heard excuses like that? And when you were rearing your children, were there ever any excuses? Why didn't you carry out the trash? Or why did you come home after the curfew time? What? And they have all these really well planned out explanations that we call excuses. Donnie spent his life as a highway patrolman. How many times do you think he stopped someone and they used some kind of excuse? Well, I was whatever. But we all realize excuses don't work very well. They don't work very well. And that's what Paul is going to be trying to show us this morning. By the way, in the Bible, you know there are a lot of excuses that are given that are kind of absurd also. When Adam and Eve are there in the early pages of the book of Genesis, and they take the forbidden fruit, and God will come and he'll speak first to Adam and say, Adam, did you take that fruit? And you'll remember how Adam responds. Well, my paraphrase sounds like this. Yes, I took that fruit, but you got to know the reason. That woman that you put here, she got the fruit and she gave it to me. And he's really blaming two entities. He's blaming the woman and he's blaming God. If you hadn't put her here, we wouldn't be in this mess. And so God turns to the woman and said, did you take that fruit? Well, yes, I took the fruit, but it's that snake you put here, that serpent you put here, that Satan you unleashed here. Had you not done that, I wouldn't be in this mess. And then there are other kinds of excuses, like the one that Moses will use when God is calling Moses to go back to Egypt and to lead his people out of bondage, and Moses does not want to return to Egypt. It's been 40 years. I don't want to go back. And so he begins to reason with God as to why he shouldn't go back. And one of his reasons is an excuse. I can't speak. I'm not able to speak well enough. And he's talking to the God who can make him able to fly if he wanted him to be able to fly. He's talking to the God who can do anything, but he says, I just can't speak. And then a little later in Moses' time as a leader, he is called up to a mountain to receive what we call the Ten Commandments, and he's been there a long time, and the people begin to rebel in a variety of ways, and Aaron, his brother, makes that golden calf, and they're creating all kinds of idolatry and sin around that golden calf, and Moses comes back down the mountain and sees all this, and at some point he questions Aaron and says, Aaron, did you do this? And Aaron said, well, yeah, I did this, but those people were talking to me and persuading me and forcing me, and I really had no choice. And besides that calf, I just collected all these little golden trinkets and I threw it into the fire. And would you believe that calf just came out like that? Now, that's life. That's life. When we get in a hot spot, a difficult spot, we have this reasoning to try to justify ourselves, and we're hoping that will work everything out, that everything will work well. But there are times excuses don't work. Last week we introduced the book of Romans, saying that Paul says this beautiful thing, that there is a righteousness from God that is available through the story of Jesus, or the gospel of Jesus. And we recognized last week that we, by ourselves, of ourselves, have no righteousness. We just don't have it. We are sinful people. We are people who make all kinds of mistakes. But God, in His graciousness, says, I will cover you with my righteousness. And someday we're going to be judged. And we're going to be judged by His Son Jesus, who came to this earth. Now, the judgment's really going to work like this. Have you been covered with the righteousness of God, or have you not? And if you have not been, how are you going to explain that? What are you going to say to God if you haven't been? What kind of excuse are you going to give? You know, it's a little out of context, but it's not too far out of context that Jesus will tell a story in Matthew chapter 25 about that very event when He comes back to judge the world. And He says, I'm going to separate the people. And the way He's going to separate the people are between those who are covered in His righteousness and those who are not covered in His righteousness. And He's going to say to those who are not covered in His righteousness, you're going to have to depart from me into a really bad place, because you didn't take care of me. I was sick and you didn't take care of me. I was in prison, you didn't visit me. I was without clothing, you didn't bother to give me clothes. I was hungry, you didn't give me any food. And these people are going to say, or do say, well, Jesus, we never saw you like that. If we would have seen you like that, we would have taken care of you. We never saw you. It's not our fault. And Jesus just says to him, you weren't looking. Because when you didn't take care of these little ones of mine, these people of mine, in the same way, you weren't taking care of me. Excuses on that day are not going to work. And that's exactly what Paul wants us to know. So I want to read you this one verse. After he's talking about the righteousness of God, I want you to look at verse 20. It's all in this context about whether or not we're covered in the righteousness of God. He says, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Now, what he's saying is, Paul is saying, the world is full of wickedness, and the world is full of all this sin. And here I'm offering you my righteousness through my Son. And what I want you to know is you have no excuse for not accepting it. And don't play this card on me that you didn't really know about God, because He can be seen everywhere. Everywhere you look, you see the evidence of God. Now, at this point in this lesson, it would be helpful if I were a biologist like you. Or it would be helpful if I was a scientist that knew all about the heavens. But I don't know any of that. But I want to try to show you what Paul was talking about. A few weeks ago, I was listening in the audience when a young man spoke for just a few minutes. I think he was a university minister. He's really young, but he said, My hobby is being a beekeeper. I keep bees. He only talked for 2 or 3 minutes, but he said something about the honeybee. Well, I was fascinated in those 2 or 3 minutes with what he said. So this week I tried to look up something about the honeybee. Now, have you ever seen those little white boxes out in the field that people take care of? In fact, if you'll remember back, if some of you who are members of this congregation in years gone by will remember that you had a person here named Ben Medlin. And Ben Medlin had a hobby of honeybees. Well, what I found was that in the beehive, there are 3 kinds of bees. There's a queen bee who resides in the center of that hive. Surrounding her are what is called drone bees. They never leave the hive. The third kind of bee is a worker bee, and those are the ones we see. The queen is inside the heart of that hive, and her job is to aid in reproduction of the colony. The drones do a couple of things. In the dead of winter, when it's really cold, they surround that queen even more tightly to keep her warm. But they also have the job of fertilizing all of the eggs from that queen so that the colony can continue. Again, they never leave the hive. So when you walk up to a hive, all you're ever going to see are the worker bees, and the worker bee, at least in the summertime, has a lifespan of only 6 weeks. That's why they have to reproduce all the time, only 6 weeks. And one of the first jobs of that worker bee, who is female but cannot reproduce, is to protect the hive. And so if you walk up to invade their space, they're going to attack you because they have the ability to sting multiple times. In fact, a few years ago, when our youngest granddaughter was probably 5 or 6 years old, she and Sue's little dog named Audie were out for a walk on one of the Lubbock streets near our house. They were passing by a really beautiful home. And all of a sudden, a swarm of bees attacked them. And what had happened is there was an unknown hive of bees in the backyard of this really nice home that had been disturbed. And those bees had already killed one of the little dogs in the backyard. And now they were swarming Sue's and Kerrigan. And a lady came by in a car just about that time, and she saw what was happening, and she stopped immediately and pulled open the door and said, "Jump in." And they jumped in, and that night on the local television station, this was featured. That's what a worker bee does. They protect. But that's only a small part of what the worker bee does. The worker bee will go out and search for pollen, and they'll bring back pollen, and they'll make honey out of it, and they deposit this honey in little wax cells. And when they get a wax cell full, they'll put wax over the top of that and seal it. We call it a honeycomb. And you say, well, where do they get the wax? Well, on the worker bee, on the underneath of their belly, there are little flakes or crystals of wax that they can extract and use to do all that. And I think I read it takes 4 million visits to find enough pollen to make 1 kilogram of honey. And when the worker bee goes out and finds one flower, it's no big deal. But if they happen to go out to a field like sweet clover and it's flowering everywhere, those worker bees will race back to the hive and they'll do a little jig, a little bee dance, literally. And it signals all the other worker bees to come with them, and they'll go in a great drove, and they'll bring all these extracts of pollen back to the hive. Now, if you would have told Paul, when he was writing the book of Romans, that I've just described happened because of 1 billion years of evolution, what do you think Paul would have said to you? I suspect Paul would have looked at you and said, "Have you lost your mind?" This is a picture of the design, the power, the perfection, the creativity of the Almighty God. Now, I want you to think about this. I have mentioned one tiny aspect of this creation. Could we not have done the same thing by looking at a mosquito or looking at a fly? A fly has to be the most amazing insect in the world. It can be 0 degrees outside, and then it warms up in my pickup, and here comes a fly. I mean, where have they been? And it's a winter where we have all those days of -9 degrees, and you think this year we'll have no flies. I'm telling you, the first day it gets warm, I go out there, my pickup swarming with flies. And we could talk about a mosquito, we could talk about a fly, we could talk about a whale, we could talk about animals over and over again and spend the entire day. And I've listened to a biology professor at Lubbock Christian University walk into churches and give illustration after illustration from the creation of God that shows his handiwork in ways you cannot deny. This is masterful. And you think about this human body and how it works and how it rebuilds itself and I haven't even touched on this thing about the earth and this universe and the galaxies that go. I don't know about all that stuff, but we tried to talk about it in the past. And Paul is saying, all you got to do is walk out and look around, and there is God. And his invisible qualities and his eternal power are undeniable. They are everywhere. So don't you think for a second that you're going to be able to approach this day of judgment and say, well, I just didn't know. I just didn't know. I kind of believed it wasn't really true. And God's going to say, did you ever open your eyes? Now, let me say a bit more about that. Because I don't open my eyes very well and see. I don't open my eyes very well and recognize God over and over again. Because I, like everyone else, tend to take things for granted. And I see the same things over and over again, and I seldom stop long enough to say, wow. But there was a spectacular moon this week. Did you see that? And there are all kinds of other things I could have looked to. And how many times Susan's pointed out to me, look at that one tree right over there. It's turned completely a different color. Isn't it so beautiful? Isn't God wonderful? And I've missed it, and she saw it. We need to be looking for God and be reminded that he's everywhere. Because if we see him in reality, maybe we want to be covered all the more in his righteousness. You and I live in a world today, I'll say it again, I've said it so many times, that's walking away from that truth. We live in a country that's suppressing and hiding that truth. I listened to a man talk also this week. I was in the audience as he was speaking. He said, do you really realize that right now in Africa there are far more Christians than there are in the United States? Far more. By far more, he said. In the nation that was formed because of God, we're now trying to deny that and walk away from it. And yet the reality of him is everywhere. And he is so good and so gracious that he shows himself to us in all of nature, saying, look, I'm here. This is me. And he's so gracious that he sent his son. He came in the form of his son to die so that we could experience his righteousness. I can't find it myself. I'm not good enough. A week passes, and every single week that passes, I can see mistake after mistake. Let me just call it sin. Sin after sin that I have made. And I find myself so very grateful when I remember that he keeps cleansing me. He keeps covering me with his righteousness if I just keep trying. Now, in the spirit of Thanksgiving this week, we're going to take the Lord's Supper. We're going to take those emblems. I'll get back up and say a few more things, but very few more things. But could it be this morning that we're just thankful? That we just be thankful that God did send his son? And can we just be thankful that God shows himself to us everywhere if we'll just open our eyes and see? Again, I want to thank you for being here with us this morning. I know it's a holiday week and a lot of people are traveling and we have some who are visiting. We're grateful for that. I think I'd like to close this by having you to think about what we said this morning from God's point of view and not from your point of view. Now, what I mean by that is, don't you suspect that God is looking at all this thinking, I have done so much and I have done all I can do. I have showed myself to you in all of nature. I have given you a book to explain everything. That book explains the coming of my son and why I sent my son. And now all I'm doing is waiting for you to be covered in the righteousness that I offer you. That's God's point of view. And it's like God is saying, what are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? Why don't you become covered in the righteousness that I offer you and live with me forever and ever and be taken care of in paradise? What an invitation from God's point of view. I just hope you will live your life with that invitation as a reality that you accept it in your life.